The stitches were dark red, the color of old wine or old blood, depending on the light. 3 of them, close together, hand-sewn into the inner lining of a canvas bag, the color of something that used to be green. Whoever had done the stitching had not been in a hurry. They were tight, even deliberate. The stitches of someone who understood that what was being sealed inside needed to stay sealed for a long time. Needed to survive being sat on, rained on, carried through bus depots and shelter intake lines and the back seats of strangers' cars. Needed to survive being forgotten, almost, on 3 separate occasions. And then remembered again, which is the harder thing. The bag was sitting on a wooden bench outside the Cedar Home bus depot at 7:12 on a Wednesday morning, and the woman holding it, 54 years old, haircut uneven at the jaw, in shades of chestnut and coming in silver. A thin, horizontal scar above her left eyebrow that nobody had asked about in years, was looking at the main street of a town she had never intended to stop in with the particular stillness of someone who has ceased being surprised by the direction life moves. She didn't know yet that the man whose name was on the brass plate across the street, Mayor Harold J. Russell, that plate polished every Monday to a shine slightly too bright for the rest of the building, had been waiting 22 years for someone exactly like her to never arrive. She was about to make him very, very wrong. But before any of that, before the reunion that would come with its fury and its grief and its 3-page letter written in a dead woman's handwriting, you need to know who Nancy Jean Hollis was before she got on the bus. Because where she started is the only way to understand why she waited as long as she did. And why, when she finally stopped waiting, she was the most dangerous thing Harold Russell had ever underestimated. One quick thing before we go back. What time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. Morning, afternoon, late night. I always love knowing when people find us. Now, back to Nancy. Nancy Jean Hollis was born in 1970 in St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, the younger of 2 daughters of Robert and Clara Hollis. Her father was a pipe fitter who worked long seasons on the offshore platforms and came home with money that smelled like petroleum and hands that didn't quite work all the way anymore in his 50s. Her mother grew vegetables in the back half of their property and had a method for everything. For canning, for managing Robert's temper in the 2 weeks after he came home and didn't know what to do with himself on land, for loving 2 daughters who were almost entirely different people. Doris, the older one, was different from Nancy in the particular way of sisters who come from the same place and take entirely different things from it. Doris was precise where Nancy was intuitive, frontal where Nancy was sideways, a note-taker where Nancy was a rememberer. Doris had the kind of confidence that came from believing that if a thing was right, it should be said plainly, and if it was wrong, it should be documented. And if it was documented, someone with the right authority would eventually do something about it. This belief was the truest thing about her, and the thing that got her killed. Nancy's version of the world was shaped by watching Doris be right and get nowhere, watching correctness run up against entrenched convenience again and again, until she understood that rightness was not its own argument. You needed the room to be ready. You needed the right person to be listening at the right moment. You needed, sometimes, to carry the truth carefully for a long time, rather than hurl it at a wall that would absorb it. This was the difference between the sisters. And for 22 years, Nancy was not sure which of them had been wise and which had been a coward. She was beginning to think it might have been both. Robert Hollis died in January of 1981 at 53 from a stroke that came on a Saturday morning while he was reading the newspaper and gave no particular warning. He left behind a wife, 2 daughters, and 14 acres of farmland in St. Mary Parish that he had paid for in installments over 20 years, and that the family had always understood to be their foundation. The thing that could not be taken. The thing that was just there. The settlement of the estate was handled by a lawyer in Cedarholm named Thomas Bennett, who had a reputation for thoroughness and a practice built on the trust of families like the Hollises. People who weren't wealthy enough to need a specialist, but needed someone careful with what they had. Thomas was 40 years old in 1981 and had been in practice for 12 years. He was careful. He was thorough. He was, at that particular moment, also under pressure that Nancy didn't know about and wouldn't understand fully until decades later. Harold James Russell, in 1981, was 26 years old and working as a junior associate in his father's law office, a firm with 3 partners and a reputation for handling matters that required flexibility in interpretation. Harold had been watching the Hollis estate since Robert died, the way certain people watch things, not with obvious interest, but with the quality of attention that is itself a kind of plan. The 14 acres were worth something. Not spectacular wealth, but solid, specific value. Farmland in good condition with water access and a clear title going back to 1951. The kind of property that appreciated quietly and reliably. The kind that, if reorganized through the right instruments at the right moment, could look from a distance like a routine administrative consolidation. What happened in the spring of 1981, what Doris spent 2 years documenting and one night writing down in a letter she never sent, was this. Harold Russell, with his father's guidance and Thomas Bennett's unwilling signature on a supporting document, filed a secondary claim against the Hollis estate, citing an unresolved commercial lien from Robert's time on the platforms. The lien was real. Its application to the land title was not. The 14 acres were transferred in a transaction buried inside 17 pages of estate documents that Clara Hollis signed without fully reading, because Thomas told her it was standard and she trusted Thomas, into a holding entity that belonged, at 2 removes, to a company Harold's father controlled. Clara Hollis died in 1988 not knowing her land was gone in the way it had gone. She thought it had been lost to debt, something Robert had hidden from her, a failure she had accommodated into her grief without ever examining the seams of it. Doris knew otherwise. Doris had found the original deed, cross-referenced it against the estate documents, and identified the instrument by which the transfer had been made fraudulent. Doris was 31 years old and was working as an accountant in Baton Rouge, and she was meticulous, and she was angry in the way of someone who has watched a wrong thing be treated as finished for too long. She wrote a letter to a lawyer in Baton Rouge, a detailed letter with dates, document reference numbers, the name of the notary, the specific language of the fraudulent lien. She folded it inside the envelope with a photocopy of the transfer instrument, on the back of which she had written, in small, neat handwriting, "I need this reviewed independently before I file anything." There are 2 attorneys' names on this document, and one of them is now a city councilman, and I do not know yet who I can trust. She did not send the letter. She was going to send it on Monday. On Thursday night in November of 2002, Doris Hollis's car went off Route 182 in the rain, near the Bayou Teche crossing, and she was killed on impact. The investigation concluded: wet road, poor visibility, speed. No other vehicles involved. Nancy was 32 years old. She drove to Baton Rouge to help clean out Doris's apartment. In the file box under Doris's desk, the one labeled "Household" in Doris's neat print, she found the envelope. She read it once, in the apartment, sitting on the floor with Doris's coffee maker still warm on the counter. Then she folded it back, slid it into the inner lining of the canvas bag she'd brought for Doris's things, and sewed it shut with 3 stitches of dark red thread she found in Doris's sewing kit. She told herself she was protecting it until she knew what to do. She told herself that for 22 years. Those years were not nothing. They were not simply waiting. They were living, which is harder and less deliberate and more exhausting than waiting ever is. Nancy married in 1995 a man named Dale, who was steady for 4 years and then steadily less so. And they divorced in 2012 without particular drama, which is its own kind of sad. She had Sharon in 1997. Sharon, who had Dale's eyes and Nancy's way of going very still when something mattered, and who grew up watching her mother carry something she couldn't name and learning, as children do, to navigate around it rather than ask about it. Nancy worked for 11 years as an administrative secretary at a law firm in Baton Rouge, Whitley, Pratt and Associates, where she learned over the course of those years the exact texture of how legal systems absorb inconvenient truths. She learned how long things can sit in filing cabinets. She learned that documents are not the same as justice. She learned that the person who files a complaint needs not only evidence, but credibility. And credibility, she understood with the particular clarity of a woman who had watched it happen, is something that certain people can have taken from them before they ever do anything wrong. She kept the envelope. She moved apartments 4 times, and the envelope moved with her. She held it sometimes on the anniversaries of Doris's death, not to read it, just to hold it. The way you hold things that belong to the dead to prove they were real. In 2018, the law firm she worked for was investigated for a billing fraud she had witnessed 2 years earlier and reported internally and been told by 3 different people in 3 different meetings was being addressed. It was not being addressed. When it eventually came apart, it came apart on the people who had filed paperwork, not on the partners who had designed the scheme. Nancy lost her job. Her apartment lease was tied to the job. She spent 4 months in a shelter in Baton Rouge before a cousin in Lafayette let her stay in a back room that smelled of mildew and had a window that didn't close all the way. After Lafayette, there was Opelousas, then Morgan City, then a stretch of months that she didn't account for in clean narrative because they didn't have clean narrative. Just the specific arithmetic of surviving in the way that doesn't have a good name. The kind where you're not in crisis, exactly, but you're not in crisis. And every day is a small logistical problem that you solve. And the solving is the whole of it. She boarded a bus in Morgan City on a Tuesday afternoon with a ticket to Baton Rouge and a bag that held a change of clothes, her phone charger, $60 in cash, and, in the inner lining, sewn shut, still there, a letter that Doris Hollis had written 22 years ago and that Nancy had never been ready to know what to do with. The bus developed a fault in the fuel line 3 miles outside Cedar Home. The driver said they'd be there 2 hours, minimum. Nancy got out to stretch her legs. She saw the brass plate on the building across the street. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time. Then she went into the diner next door, ordered coffee, and sat by the window. The diner was called Mabel's, and it had the quality of places that have been the same for so long that they've become a kind of fact. The checkered floor worn smooth in the traffic paths, the counter stools with their vinyl cracked in identical patterns, the glass pie case with 3 kinds in it that rotated on a schedule the regulars knew without being told. The woman behind the counter was not Mabel. Mabel had died in 1999, but she had the manner of someone who had absorbed the diner's personality over decades until it was indistinguishable from her own. Nancy drank her coffee and watched the building across the street. The brass plate caught the morning light and threw it back slightly, a small cold flash every few minutes as the angle shifted. She was there for 2 hours. When the driver announced they were boarding, she did not get up. The bus left without her. She found the Hayes boarding house by asking at the gas station, which was also the post office and the place where people left notices for things they were selling. The woman at the counter said Rosemary Hayes sometimes took in people on a work-for-room arrangement if you were willing and upfront about what you had, which Nancy was. The Hayes boarding house was a two-story structure of dark green painted wood on Magnolia Street, 2 blocks from the square, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front and most of the left side. It had 4 rooms and, currently, 2 other guests: a retired electrician who was there while his house was being repainted, and a woman visiting her sister's medical appointments. Rosemary Hayes was 69 years old and had the economy of movement of someone who had been running a household alone for 8 years and had adjusted every action to exactly the energy it required, no more. She looked at Nancy for about 4 seconds at the door, at the bag, the uneven hair, the scar, the way Nancy stood without moving the weight of the bag around the way people do when they're uncomfortable, and said, "Mornings are floors and bathrooms. Afternoons are yours. There's a room at the back with a window that catches the bayou in the evenings, if the wind is right. Come in." She did not ask about the bag. She did not ask about where Nancy had come from or where she was going. This was a policy she applied to all guests and which Nancy recognized within 12 hours as the rarest gift a person can offer another person: the decision not to require an explanation. The next morning, at 6 o'clock exactly, Nancy woke to find a cup of coffee with milk on the windowsill outside her room. She had not heard Rosemary move through the hall. She sat on the edge of the bed with the cup for a long time, the bayou smell coming in with the cool of the morning, jasmine and water and cypress root, and tried to remember the last time someone had given her something without it costing anything. She spent 3 days trying to figure out what time Rosemary woke up to do it. She never did. On the 5th day in Cedar Home, Nancy walked to the parish courthouse and asked at the records desk whether inventories from the early 1980s were accessible to the public. The woman at the desk, young, reading glasses, the expression of someone managing a workload not designed for one person, said yes, the records were public, and gave her a form to fill out with the parcel or case number she was looking for. Nancy wrote, Hollis Estate, St. Mary Parish, 1981. Parcel registration under Robert E. Hollis. The woman took the form and disappeared into the back. She came back 12 minutes later with a look that was not quite what Nancy expected. Not the neutral helpfulness of before, but something slightly careful, as if she'd remembered something she wasn't going to mention. She said the records for that file had been consolidated in a 1994 administrative reorganization, and that requests for consolidated files needed to go through the county administrator's office. Nancy said, "And who is the county administrator?" The woman said, "The mayor's office oversees the administrator's office. You'd need to submit a written request." Nancy looked at the woman. The woman looked at her form. Nancy said, "Thank you," and left. She walked back to the boarding house slowly, past the square, past the brass plate catching its light. She stopped in front of the building for a moment, not long, just long enough to read the plate once, as if confirming something. Harold James Russell, Mayor, Cedar Home Parish. She went to the diner and sat at the counter with coffee and the local weekly paper, which she read entirely, including the legal notices section, which almost nobody read. In the legal notices, on the second to last page, was a small announcement. The Cedar Home Parish Council would hold a public session on Tuesday evening to discuss a proposed update to the county's administrative records retention policy. Nancy read the announcement twice. Then she read the date in the legal notice header, March the 4th. She went back to the boarding house and opened the canvas bag. She took out the envelope from the inner lining, unsealing the dark red stitches for the first time in 22 years, with the small embroidery scissors from Rosemary's sewing basket. And she read Doris's letter, all of it, for the first time since the night she found it. It took 17 minutes. When she finished, she sat very still, with the letter open on the bed in front of her. Then she blinked once, slowly. Then she folded it back into the envelope. She picked up her phone and called Sharon. Sharon picked up on the fourth ring and said, the way she always answered, "Mom." Not a greeting, a fact, a small brace. Nancy said, "I need to tell you something, but I need a few more days first." And then, before Sharon could respond, "There's a job offer from the Cedar Home mayor's office. I know about it." Silence. Then, "How do you know about that?" "Do not sign anything yet," Nancy said. "Please." Another silence. The particular kind Sharon had when she was calculating whether this was worth the energy of a fight. Then, "I haven't signed. The offer just came yesterday." "I know," Nancy said. "Don't. Not yet." She hung up. She sat with the letter. Outside, the Bayou Frogs started up at 6:45, as they always did, right on the invisible schedule that the town used as a clock. Their sound filled the room. A steady, wet percussion, alive and indifferent and very old. And Nancy listened to it until it was dark. The next morning, she went to find Thomas Bennett. She'd found his name in Doris's letter, in the section that described the signing of the estate documents. Thomas Bennett, attorney, Cedar Home. He signed the supporting instrument and then would not return my calls for 4 months. She'd found his current address in the local directory at the boarding house desk, the kind of printed directory that small towns still maintained because a percentage of the population preferred it. His office was on Pecan Street, in a converted Victorian with a painted shingle out front. Thomas J. Bennett, attorney at law, retired. Consultations by appointment. The porch had a large fern in a terracotta pot hanging from the beam. Nancy knocked, waited, knocked again. A voice from inside said, "I'm not taking appointments this week." She said, "I'm not here about an appointment, Mr. Bennett. I'm here about a woman named Doris Hollis." The silence that followed was long enough that Nancy counted it. 12 seconds. She knew because she was watching the fern move slightly in the morning air, and she counted the sways. The door opened. Thomas Bennett was 71 years old and had the look of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had organized his entire life around not being asked what it was. He was thinner than his age should have made him, with a particular leanness of chronic poor sleep. He wore a flannel shirt in green and brown plaid despite the Louisiana heat. His eyes, when they found Nancy's face, moved through several things quickly before settling on a kind of resignation. He did not say hello. He said, "Come in." Inside, the office smelled of old paper and something floral. The large bird of paradise fern by the window, which Nancy had heard him mention through the door to imaginary visitors, was real and enormous, and the kind of lush that required constant attention. The room was tidy, in the way of a man who had nothing pressing to organize anymore, and so organized everything. Books alphabetical on the shelves, papers stacked with their edges aligned. A coffee mug with no coffee in it, placed exactly in the center of the desk blotter. Thomas sat behind the desk. Nancy sat across from him. She did not take the letter out yet. She looked at him. She said, "She wrote a letter before she died. I've had it for 22 years. Thomas was very still. She said, "I need you to look at something and tell me if what she described is what you remember." He looked at the canvas bag on her lap, then at her face. He said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that for 22 years. A pause. I wasn't sure anyone ever would. Nancy opened the bag. She removed the envelope. She slid it across the desk. Thomas Bennett picked it up with both hands and held it for a moment before opening it. The way you hold a thing you recognize, a thing that has weight you remember. And then he opened it slowly and removed the contents. He unfolded the letter. He began to read, and Nancy watched the face of a man who had signed something he shouldn't have, and who had lived with it for 40 years, as he read the words of a woman who had documented exactly what that signature had cost. He read for 9 minutes. When he finished, he set the pages down carefully. He looked at the second page, the photocopy of the transfer instrument, the page that Nancy had read but had not studied closely, because for 22 years she had been focused on the letter and not the enclosure. Thomas turned the photocopy over. He read the back. He went very still. Nancy said, "What is it?" Thomas said nothing for a moment. He turned the page toward her so she could see what was written on the back, in small handwriting that was not Doris's handwriting. Nancy looked at it. She had seen it before. She had seen it when she'd read the letter years ago, and had assumed it was Doris's notation. A shorthand. She looked at Thomas. Thomas said, "That's not Doris's handwriting." Nancy looked at the note again. "That's Eugene Russell's handwriting," Thomas said. "I worked across the hall from his firm for 6 years. I would recognize it anywhere." He paused. Harold was 26 years old. I thought he was a junior associate who'd inherited his father's files after the fact. I thought. He stopped. "He was consulted before it happened," Nancy said. Thomas looked at her. "He signed off on it," she said, "before the transfer was made." Thomas was quiet for 40 seconds. His hands were flat on the desk, and Nancy noticed. She noticed everything, which was the skill of a woman who had survived by attention, that they were not trembling. They were simply placed. The way hands are placed when a person is deciding something with their whole body, not just their mind. He said, "I have the original estate filing in my personal archive. I kept a copy because..." He stopped again, started differently. "I kept a copy because some part of me always knew I would need to account for it someday." Nancy said, "Will you help me?" Thomas looked at the fern by the window, the enormous bird of paradise, lush and attentive, that he had tended for years as a reason to avoid visitors. He did not say, "I'm busy with the fern." He said, "Yes." And Nancy understood from that single syllable, from the way it came out without hesitation, as if it had been waiting there, ready for a very long time, that Thomas Bennett had just put down the heaviest thing he'd been carrying. She put the letter back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the bag. She said, "Then I'll need to call my daughter." Sharon arrived the following Thursday, 2 days earlier than Nancy had expected. Nancy found out because she received a text message at 6:40 in the morning, before Rosemary's Coffee appeared on the windowsill, that said only, "I'm at Mabel's. Come when you can." Sharon had the tone of someone who had made a decision while Nancy wasn't available to complicate it. Nancy recognized it because it was her own tone. She washed her face, dressed, and walked to the diner. Sharon was at the counter with coffee and the specific expression of a daughter who has been managing her own feelings about her mother for years and is currently managing them in real time. She was 28 years old and had Nancy's way of going still, and Dale's eyes, and the posture of someone who has learned that erect shoulders are a preventative measure. She was wearing a blazer over a light shirt. She dressed for something she expected to need competence for, which meant she'd been thinking about this on the drive from Memphis. She said, "I got the official offer letter from the mayor's office yesterday. They moved up the start date by 2 weeks." She looked at Nancy. "And your text last week. Don't sign yet, please." "So I drove instead of calling, because I figured whatever this is, I should see your face when you tell me." Nancy sat down on the stool beside her daughter. She put the canvas bag on the counter between them. She said, "Your Aunt Doris. I know you know the name. I know I haven't told you more than the name." She stopped. She was trying to find the right place to begin, the way you look for a seam in something that has no seams. She said, She was the bravest person I ever knew. She found something that was being hidden, and she documented it, because that's what she did. She documented things, because she believed that documentation was the same as truth being protected. She put her hand on the bag. She wrote it down, everything she found. She was going to send it to a lawyer. A pause. She didn't make it. Sharon was very still. Her coffee was getting cold and she hadn't touched it. The man who runs this town, Nancy said, is the man Doris was trying to stop. And you were about to go work for him. Sharon looked at the bag, at the irregular stitching along the flap, the places where the canvas had been repaired with thread of different colors, at the 3 dark red stitches on the inner lining, small and even and deliberate. She said quietly, "How long have you had it?" 22 years, Nancy said. Sharon looked at her mother. "I didn't know what to do with it for a long time," Nancy said. "And then She searched for the right word. "I was in places where knowing what to do required things I didn't have." She looked at her daughter directly. "And then I heard about the job offer, and I got on a bus." Sharon was quiet for a long moment. The counter was between them, and it felt both like a very small distance and like a very large one. Then she said, "Show me." Nancy unsealed the dark red stitches one more time. She set the envelope on the counter. Sharon took it with both hands, the same way Thomas had taken it, Nancy noticed. The way people take things they understand are significant before they know what they contain. And she opened it. She read. She read the whole of Doris's letter and the transfer document and the notation on the back that Thomas had identified. She read it without interruption, without comment, in the particular focused silence of a woman who is putting together the shape of something she has been living with the edges of her whole life, without seeing the center. When she finished, she set the papers down carefully. She did not cry. She went absolutely still. The stillness that was theirs, hers and Nancy's. The one that looked from the outside like composure, but was something else entirely. Nancy looked at her daughter's face and saw it. Saw the moment her daughter recognized herself in the stillness. Saw her understand where it came from. Saw the thread between them become visible for the first time. Neither of them said anything. Outside, a truck went past on the main street. The checkered floor of Mabel's caught the morning light at a low angle, and the worn patches in the traffic paths showed pale against the darker squares. The record of every person who had ever walked through this particular room. And Nancy said, "Now, we go see Thomas Bennett." Thomas Bennett was already at his desk when they arrived, which meant he had been expecting them, or had been sitting there regardless, in the specific way of men who no longer distinguish between waiting for something and simply existing. He looked at Sharon, the way people look at a person they are meeting for the first time, while simultaneously understanding who they come from. He said, "You look like Doris." Then, after a pause, "That's a compliment. It's intended as one." Sharon sat in the chair across from him. Nancy stood near the window, close enough to the bird of paradise fern that she could have touched it. She didn't, but she stood there, and the plant's large leaves framed her the way curtains frame a window. And Thomas, looking past Sharon at Nancy, thought, "This woman has been patient enough for all of it. This is what patience of that kind looks like in a person." He opened his desk drawer and removed a manila folder. New, not the kind that had been sitting there. He had clearly transferred its contents recently, perhaps that morning. He set it on the desk between himself and Sharon. "This is my copy of the original estate filing," he said. "The documents are dated 1981. The instrument by which the land was transferred includes my signature." He looked at Sharon directly. "I signed it under representation that it was a standard consolidation of a debt instrument attached to the estate. I was told The lien was valid. I had reason to question it, and I did not question it to the degree I should have. He paused. I'm telling you this before you look at anything, because I want you to understand what I'm asking you to corroborate when I stand in front of someone and say that I was present and that the transfer was improper. Sharon looked at him. You're willing to say that? I've been willing to say it for 20 years, Thomas said. I needed someone to ask. He looked at his folder. And I needed someone who had documentation that would survive Harold's attorneys, which on my own I did not. He had spent the 2 days since Nancy's visit reconstructing the sequence: the Hollis estate, the transfer instrument, the secondary lien filing, the specific notary who had witnessed the fraudulent claim. He had found, in his archive, the meticulously organized archive that he kept because some part of him had always known he would need it, the original case file with the working notes from 1981. In those notes, in his own handwriting, was a notation dated 3 weeks before the transfer. Russell Jr. present at preliminary review. Aware of lien strategy. Confirm WER before proceeding. Confirm with Eugene Russell before proceeding. Harold had known. Not after the fact, not inherited along with the practice. He had been present at the preliminary review. He had confirmed the strategy. The notation on the back of Doris's photocopy, H knows, was not a suspicion. It was a fact that Doris had verified from a source Nancy had never been able to identify. The source, they now understood, had been Thomas himself, in a conversation he had with Doris in late 2002 when she had called him again, after months of silence, and told him what she had found and what she was about to do. And he had said, and this was the thing he had carried for 22 years in the specific way of cowards who stop just short of the action. He had said, Doris, Harold was in the room. He was there at the beginning.
I'm so sorry.
I can't help you with this. I'm sorry. He had not helped. She had died 3 weeks later. He had kept the file. He said none of this to Nancy and Sharon in those words, but they understood the shape of it from what he did say, and from how he said it, and from the particular quality of stillness he had while he said it. The stillness of a man delivering a confession he has rehearsed alone, in the dark, for a very long time. Sharon said, "What do we need to do?" Thomas looked at her. I know the State Attorney General's office in Baton Rouge. I know someone in the Civil Division who handles historic property fraud. If we bring them the letter, the photocopy, my working notes, and my sworn statement, we don't need a judge in Cedar Home. We go above the local structure entirely. Nancy said from the window, "That's what Doris was trying to do." Thomas looked at her. "She was trying to find someone outside the local system," Nancy said. "Someone who didn't owe Harold anything." She paused. That's what she was writing the letter for. The room was quiet. The fern moved slightly in the air from the window. Thomas said, "Then we finish what she started." They called the Attorney General's Civil Division that afternoon. Thomas made the call himself, using a name that got the call returned within 2 hours. The particular kind of call return that happens when a retired attorney with a known file is the one asking. The contact's name was Renee Dauphin. She was 43, methodical, and had the focused quality of someone who had spent a career on cases where the documentation was very old and the principals were very comfortable. She asked Thomas a series of questions whose precision suggested she had done this before. She asked for the materials to be sent by secure courier within 48 hours. Thomas prepared the package himself. He included Doris Hollis's original letter, authenticated by a document specialist Thomas contacted in Lafayette, who confirmed the handwriting, paper, and ink were consistent with the early 2000s. The photocopy of the transfer instrument with the H knows notation on the back, with a letter from Thomas identifying the handwriting as Eugene Russell's from his own professional memory and personal correspondence archive. Thomas's working notes from 1981, including the notation about Harold's presence at the preliminary review. Thomas's sworn statement, notarized, affirming his direct knowledge of the improper transfer and Harold Russell's participation. Nancy signed a statement as well, attesting to the chain of custody of the letter from the night she found it in Doris's apartment to the morning she unsealed it in the Hayes boarding house. Sharon drove the package to the courier office in New Iberia herself. When she came back, she sat on the porch of the boarding house with Nancy. The Bayou Frogs were starting their 6:45 chorus. Rosemary brought 2 cups of coffee and set them on the railing without commentary and went back inside. And Nancy thought, she knows. She might not know specifically, but she knows the shape of it. Sharon wrapped both hands around her cup. She said, I never knew anything about Doris. I knew she existed. I knew she died in a car accident when I was 5. I knew you never talked about her. She looked at the bayou light fading in the trees. I didn't know that she spent years. She stopped. Nancy said, she was the most organized person I ever met. She had a system for everything. She paused. And she was so certain that if you had the right documentation and you presented it to the right person, something would happen. She really believed that. She wasn't wrong, Sharon said. Nancy looked at her. She just ran out of time, Sharon said. The documentation was right. It was real. It just needed more time than she had. Nancy looked at the bayou trees and thought about this. About the 22 years of carrying that had felt like failing, and that her daughter was now calling something else. She felt the particular shift of a thing being looked at from an angle that changes its shape without changing its substance. She said, she would have liked you. Sharon was quiet for a moment. Then softly, tell me something about her. Something small. Nancy thought. She said, she ate her toast plain. No butter, no jam. She said the butter made you miss the bread. Sharon almost smiled. That's an incredibly annoying thing to believe. She was sometimes an incredibly annoying person, Nancy said. The kind you'd do anything to have back. They sat together until the light was entirely gone. Harold Russell did not know what had been sent to Baton Rouge. He knew by the second week after Nancy had arrived in Cedar Home that her presence was a problem. He knew the surname, Hollis, with the instantaneous recognition of a man who has been waiting to hear it for decades without expecting to. He'd had his assistant Glenda run a search on Nancy Jean Hollis, and what had come back was exactly what he'd expected. An itinerant woman, years of instability, no fixed address, no professional affiliation. The kind of profile that in his experience could be discredited before it said anything that needed discrediting. He made his remarks at the council meeting without drama. The comment about broken people, delivered in the tone of reasonable concern, the pivot to other business executed smoothly. He had done this before, positioned someone as troubled before they could position themselves as credible. It was a matter of timing. He did not know about Thomas. He had not considered Thomas, had not thought about Thomas in genuinely several years. Thomas was retired. Thomas was keeping to himself. Thomas had his fern and his archive and his reputation as a man who had quietly removed himself from Cedar Home's professional life without explanation, which Harold had read for 12 years as the natural posture of guilt managing itself. He had not considered that guilt sometimes reaches a threshold. The Tuesday council meeting, the one Harold had called to vote on the administrative records retention policy, was, in Harold's estimation, a cleanup measure. Making the county's older inventories inaccessible through standard public request channels would not destroy anything. It would simply require an additional layer of formal process that most individuals wouldn't navigate. A fence, not a wall, the kind of measure that passed without commentary in small county councils, where the agenda was long and people had other things to get home to. He arrived at the meeting in his white linen suit, the handkerchief in the breast pocket folded in its precise triangle, his assistant Glenda carrying the session materials. The council chamber was in the municipal building. Cypress wood walls, the plaque of past mayors on the left wall in chronological order. Harold's own photo at the end of the row, the most recent, the only one in color. 6 council members around the table, a dozen residents in the public gallery chairs. Sharon Hollis, he had noted with the careful non-reactivity of a man who never let his attention be tracked, sitting in the third row with the unsigned contract in her portfolio. The session opened at 7. Harold was at the head of the table. He had run 342 council meetings over 11 years. He knew the rhythm of them the way musicians know tempos. When to push, when to let a pause extend, when to call a vote before the energy had a chance to dissipate into discussion. He was 4 agenda items in, past the routine approvals, into the records retention item, when the chamber door opened at the back. Thomas Bennett walked in. Harold saw him first, before anyone else registered the significance, because Harold was always watching the door. He saw Thomas, the flannel shirt, the particular way he moved, the paper folder under his arm, and for a single, uncontrolled instant, his eyes went to the folder. Then he saw Nancy Hollis, half a step behind. Then he saw Sharon, who had turned in her seat and was watching her mother cross the chamber with an expression Harold could not read in the 2 seconds he had before he had to look away. He looked away. He said, because the silence was lasting too long, "We'll take a brief recess." Thomas Bennett sat down at the public comment table. He opened the folder. He said, in the register of a man addressing a formal proceeding, not loudly, not performed, simply clear. "Mr. Mayor, members of the council, my name is Thomas Bennett. I was a licensed attorney in this parish for 30 years. I'm here to request a procedural hold on Agenda Item 7, the Records Retention Amendment, pending review of materials relevant to the inventory of the Hollis estate, filed 1981, which I have reason to believe was executed improperly with the knowledge and participation of the current mayor." The council chamber went quiet in the specific way of rooms that contain people trying to calculate simultaneously what they have just heard and what it means for them. Harold sat very still. His hands were flat on the table. He blinked twice in the slightly slowed cadence that his assistant Glenda had learned to recognize across 15 years as the sign of something genuinely wrong. Sharon, in the third row, had turned fully in her chair. She was watching the back of Harold Russell's white linen suit and watching it understand something that could not be ununderstood. She placed the unsigned contract carefully in her portfolio. She did not take it out again. Harold Russell resigned 6 weeks later. His attorney filed the resignation with a statement that used the phrases "personal health considerations" and "desire to focus on family," in the way that statements of that kind do when they are trying to account for a decision without accounting for its cause. The county paper ran it on page 2. The state paper ran it on page 1, beneath a headline about a civil investigation into historic property fraud in St. Mary Parish. The 14 acres, Robert Hollis's land, Doris's land, the land that had sat inside Harold's holding company for 43 years, entered formal restitution proceedings. The process would take, René Dauphin's office estimated, 6 to 8 months. Sharon, who had taken the bar exam twice and passed the second time and had the particular precision with legal documents that came from growing up in proximity to the awareness that documents matter, started attending the proceedings with Thomas as a non-practicing observer taking notes on a legal pad. Thomas, asked later by a reporter from the state paper whether he had kept the file for 40 years with the intention of eventually using it, said, "I kept it because throwing it away would have made me a different kind of man than I was trying to be." He paused. "I didn't always succeed at that, but I kept the file." The reporter asked what had finally moved him to act. He said, "A woman came to my door and said a name I'd been waiting to hear. And this time, I didn't say I was busy." Harold's white linen suit was never seen in Cedar Home after the resignation. His wife, Marlene, continued to live in the house on the north end of town. His assistant, Glenda, who had 15 years of his calendar, his correspondences, and his habits, took a job at the county clerk's office, where she was considered extremely organized. The handkerchief from the breast pocket, the one that had fallen in the council chamber when Harold stood abruptly and that no one had picked up, was found by the janitor the next morning and placed in the lost and found box by the entrance. It stayed there for 4 weeks. Then the janitor threw it away, because some things are just not worth holding. Sharon stayed in Cedar Home for 11 weeks. She found a short-term sublet on Oak Street, a block from the boarding house, and spent the mornings with Thomas going through the restitution proceedings and the afternoons on the covered porch of the Hayes boarding house with Nancy. Rosemary, who had watched the entire story unfold in the particular way of landladies who see everything and say almost nothing, began making 2 cups of coffee for the 6 o'clock windowsill run. Nancy's room and the chair at the end of the porch where Sharon most often sat. It was on an afternoon in the 6th week, with the bayou frogs beginning their early chorus and the last light going amber through the cypress trees, that Sharon asked about Doris. She said, "Tell me what she laughed at." Nancy thought about this. "Bad jokes," she said finally. "The worse, the better." She had a collection of them. She kept them in a little notebook. A pause. She said the point of a bad joke was that it required you to think less about the world being terrible for 30 seconds. Sharon smiled. A small one, not quite reached all the way, the kind that is also something else. She said, "What was her handwriting like?" Nancy said, "Like she was in a hurry to get everything down before she forgot any of it." She looked at her hands. She was always afraid of forgetting things. She wrote everything down because she didn't trust her own memory to hold it. "She trusted the paper," Sharon said. "She trusted the paper," Nancy agreed. They were quiet. The frogs, the light, the smell of jasmine and bayou water, and Rosemary's coffee coasting in from the kitchen window. Sharon said, "I'm glad you kept it." Nancy looked at her. "The letter," Sharon said. I know you've wondered whether you should have done something sooner, whether keeping it was what it was." She looked at the bayou trees. "But if you'd brought it out at any other time, you wouldn't have had Thomas. And Thomas is what made it work. And you didn't have the documentation, the notation on the back, his working notes. Without those, it's a dead woman's letter. It's nothing any prosecutor takes seriously." She looked at her mother. "You didn't keep it because you were afraid. You kept it because you were waiting for the room to be ready." Nancy looked at her daughter for a long time. She said, "Your grandfather used to say something like that." Sharon looked up. "Your grandfather who you never met?" Nancy said. "He said, you go when the table is set, not before." She paused. "I didn't know I was following his advice. I thought I was just surviving." Sharon said, "Maybe that's the same thing sometimes." The frogs went on. The light finished going. Rosemary brought 2 more coffees and set them on the railing without comment, the way she always did, without asking, without waiting for gratitude, just placing warmth where warmth was needed. Nancy wrapped her hands around the cup. She said Doris's name out loud. Just the name, nothing attached to it, just the word in the air above the bayou, and it did not feel like trespassing anymore. It felt like something being returned to where it belonged. The restitution of the Hollis land was formalized on a Tuesday morning in Baton Rouge, 8 months after Thomas Bennett walked into the Cedar Home Council chamber with a folder under his arm. Sharon and Nancy attended together. Thomas sat beside them. René Dauphin's office read the order into the record. The 14 acres of farmland in St. Mary Parish, Robert Hollis's land, Doris's land, the land that had waited 40 years in the wrong column of the wrong ledger, was transferred back into the Hollis name. Sharon took the paperwork. She held it with both hands. The way her mother held things, she understood to be significant. Steadily, without drama, with her whole attention. She said, "What do we do with the land?" Nancy said, "I don't know yet, but it's ours to figure out." That was enough for today. Some women survive by staying quiet. The brave ones know exactly when to stop. A letter never sent still tells the truth. It just waits for the right hands. Doris Hollis wrote a letter in 2002 that never reached the person she addressed it to. It reached instead the person it needed to reach. And it reached her 22 years later, which is not late exactly, which is right on time exactly, for the moment that was waiting. Rosemary Hayes, when asked by her niece in Lafayette what she'd thought when Nancy first showed up at her door, said, "I thought, that woman is carrying something. You could see it in the way she held the bag." A pause. "I figured she'd either put it down while she was here, or she'd leave with it." Turns out she put it down and left the thing that needed to be left. Her niece asked, "Did you know what it was?" Rosemary said, "No, but some things you don't need to know. You just need to leave a cup of coffee on the windowsill and let the person get to where they're going. Now, before you go, I want to ask you something." Doris wrote a letter she never sent. Nancy carried it for 22 years, and when the time finally came, it changed everything. Is there something you're carrying right now? Something you know is true? Something that needs to be said or done or finally put down? That you've been waiting for the right moment to act on? Leave it in the comments if you want, or just think about it. And if this story reminded you of someone, a sister, a mother, a friend who carried something quietly for a long time, share it with them today. Some stories find the right person right when they need it. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. Doris would have appreciated it. I know I do.